Hey guys, today I'm going to be talking about anorexia specifically as an eating disorder. And the interesting thing about anorexia is, for some reason, and I can say that for myself this is probably true as well when I was really eating disordered, is that anorexia is like I guess, if you were going to say if there was a pecking order for eating disorder values and what people valued, probably anorexia is it, because it centers so much around thinness. It is people who, under diagnostic criteria, meet the criteria for anorexia, have to be underweight and have to have lost their menstrual cycle and have to meet specific medical criteria. So this is kind of an interesting phenomenon. The other thing is that anorexia is probably the most, I guess, glorified eating disorders. I'd say it's the most, definitely the most sensationalized in the media that we hear about, that we see, from movie stars who supposedly have anorexia. Anorexia is it, and it's almost, and it's not a new concept either. The 1500s, there were people in the Catholic Church who considered themselves to be holy anorexics, and basically they would starve themselves to become closer to God. And so, and the reasons behind anorexia these days are not much different, actually. Overall, there is a book called Spirituality and Eating Disorders that was published by Dr. Michael Barrett, and it's actually kind of an interesting book because it's the only book that I know that has some real clinical data backing studies that track spirituality with people with eating disorders. And anorexia is the disorder that tends to be, that people with anorexia actually tend to be more, I guess, spiritually based in some way, whether that's religiously based. That depends on, I guess, how you look at it, but definitely a spiritual component of self-sacrificing and an attempt to be better. And that can be interpreted and probably played out in a lot of different ways. It doesn't necessarily have to be centered around God or Jesus. If Christianity happens to be your form of spirituality, then it could play out that way, but it definitely could play out in other ways as well. But spirituality seems to be tied with anorexia. And you see this in a lot of different places, like on a lot of pro-ada discussion boards. I think this comes out as being very competitive amongst people with eating disorders in doing things such as excuse me. Okay. So I had a sneezer. Such as, posting things that support each other's eating disordered behaviors. I won't go into all those because I don't. I would really rather not trigger people, or people go out and search those things. I realize that people do that, but and I'm just saying that because I know people know that those sites are out there. But I highly discourage people from doing that because it really distorts the sort of mindset. So that competitiveness, that drive to perfection, to be, holy, however holy is, can come out in many ways. And so, so a lot of times people with anorexic, I would say even in our anorexic behaviors, because a lot of times people feel like they have not reached yet the pinnacle of their eating disorder or worth if they cannot be diagnosed as anorexic. There's kind of a pride associated with it because of those reasons. And so there's a huge motivation to protect the disorder and the disease. And it can be very difficult to approach somebody who has anorexia and to convince them that there is a problem. Because a lot of times in your mind, if you have anorexia, you so much value your ability to not eat, to go without, to abstain as a strength, whereas everybody else has the weakness and has the problem because they're the ones that are eating. They're the ones that have to give in, and you are not. And for sure there is some kind of a strength with that. However, it is a misguided strength, and it is one that once you can get into recovery or find a reason to identify yourself differently, then that same strength can be turned around and to help you in recovery, because recovery is a very difficult process for anybody. But yeah, I would say at the core of people who have anorexia, there is a strength, and that would be true of all eating disorders. However, getting that strength to a non-distorted state, to a healthy state, is what the challenge is. So some of the features with anorexia or overexercise, severe restriction, and there's different types of anorexia. So there's a purging type anorexia where people may eat normally and have more like bulimic type tendencies. However, they do lose weight and they meet the criteria for having an anorexic body type, so they are categorized as anorexia with purging type. Or restricting type anorexia, people who restrict their calories and may also overexercise, and may also have some purging tendencies as well. And typically, typically there's not a black and white box for most people with anorexia, actually, or any eating disorder, because I know for myself and many others that there's kind of a spectrum of behaviors, and people who start out anorexic after a certain amount of time may eventually become bulimic, because eventually when your body's not getting food after a certain amount of time, your body automatically puts off hormones that make you want to eat, and eventually a lot of people with anorexia will binge at some point, and sometimes that only happens, that doesn't always happen. Sometimes they go through periods of binging and purging and then back to restricting, and some people with anorexia may also become binge eaters or overeaters, and so it can go back and forth, and often does. Most people actually do not stay on one spectrum of their eating disorder. It's more common to have eating disorder behaviors that switch, and maybe even switch to other substance abuse and other obsessions between eating disorder behaviors. So it's not a black and white spectrum, and that's what I want to get across to you, because people tend to think of anorexia as the pinnacle of an eating disorder, when really less than 5% of people with eating disorders can clinically be diagnosed with anorexia. And the big problem and pet peeve with that of me and many other people is that it kind of minimizes the seriousness of other disorders, or people who have not yet reached that low weight, or who are not biologically capable of reaching that low weight, because some people will not. Some people, their metabolism will shut up. They may actually gain weight. They may stop losing. It really is difficult to have an anorexic body type. And so it can be difficult. So when you're approaching a person with an eating disorder who has anorexia, just keep in mind that is kind of a pride factor, and they're going to be very defensive and protective of that disorder. Everybody, I think, is somewhat protective of their disorder, but people truly with anorexia, I think, probably are some of the most protected people, because it's easier to justify, I guess, avoidance of food as a strength, rather than somebody with bulimia who's purging and actively binging and purging. I think there is more shame associated with that. And so with anorexia, there may not be as much of that shame, although there still is to some degree, I think. So, about to go into part 2 of this video again this week because I'm not done talking yet. Obviously, I'm talking too much, but it's hard to say everything in 10 minutes about such a big topic of symptoms of anorexia. So, we'll go on to